Chapter 6, The Snowy Heron. But the thing about Yellow Shank is this. Once you move into the middle of the picture, you're that much closer to the dark woods. By the middle of November, it was pretty obvious that November in stupid Marysville, New York, is about the crummiest month there is for running. You never know. Things could always get worse. But in November, the valley traps thick clouds and holds them low. So the air is always wet and cold, and every day, right around the time I went outside to run with James Russell and Otis Bottom, every day, and I'm not lying, it rained. And it rained the kind of rain that's only a few degrees short of being snow and goes down your back, and pretty soon, like right away, your sweatshirt and t-shirt and all the rest are wet through, and they're so cold that you don't want them touching your skin, but what can you do? The one thing the cold made me do was pick up the pace, so even James Russell was panting by the time we got back. And Otis Bottom kept looking at me like he was wondering why we had to go so all-fired fast. But I couldn't exactly go to Mr. Ferris's class in a sopping wet t-shirt, and I had to change it before everyone else came back to the locker room because of you-know-why. James Russell and Otis Bottom figured it out, I guess. They never said anything when I took my dry clothes over to the bathroom stalls. But the week before Thanksgiving, things got darker in PE. The so-called gym teacher announced that we were going to start a new unit, volleyball, and everyone, and he meant everyone, was going to cheerfully participate because this was a team sport that required every single one of us to be part of the team. Terrific. So we strung up nets while he sat in his office, and we used masking tape to mark off the boundaries, and we knocked the balls around some, and then served overhand as if we knew what we were doing. And the so-called gym teacher came out of his office and said we were supposed to practice passing back and forth, which he'd never told us. And he went back into his office, and we passed back and forth until we all got sick of it, and then we started dodgeball with the volleyballs until the so-called gym teacher came out of his office again and hollered, and that was pretty much the end of the period. One more blah day of PE at Washington Irving Junior High School. Except that in English the next day, a runner from the principal's office came in and handed Miss Cowper a note. She read it and looked at me. "Douglas, Principal Petey would like you to stop by after school." Every eye in the classroom turned toward me. They probably figured that my twisted criminal mind had made me do something awful again. "How come?" I said. "If you mean to say, why has Principal Petey requested to see me, my answer is, I don't know. But I'm sure he will tell you." "I'm sure he will," said about 22 voices around me. "That'll do," said Miss Cowper, and with one last look at me, a little worried maybe, she turned back to the chalkboard. Lil leaned over. "What did you do?" I shrugged. "Do I have to do anything?" "Pretty much, you don't have to go see the principal unless you've done something." All right, I'll tell you. Principal Petey has a mad wife, and he has hidden her in the school attic, except that every so often she escapes." "The school," said Lil, "doesn't have an attic." "In the basement. I went down by accident, and there she was. She came at me, Mrs. Petey, like she was going to bite me to death or something. But I got away, and now Principal Petey wants to keep me quiet. He'll probably lock me up too. And then, Lil, you alone will know the terrible secret." I should tell you that I was revealing this terrible secret to Lil while Miss Cowper was trying to teach us the wonders of the adverb, and that when she asked if Lil and I had anything we'd like to share with the whole class, we stopped, quickly understanding that Miss Cowper was watching us angrily and would beat us mercilessly if we did not cease immediately. And I'm giving you that last sentence just to show that you can talk, that you too talk. And I'm giving you that last sentence to show that you can too talk and learn at the same time. But I can't read that sentence. Principal Petey made me wait for half an hour again. I guess it was his technique. Then he opened the door and told me to come in and to sit, and then he sat down behind his desk and underneath the brown pelican and looked at me like I was personally responsible for causing all the problems of Washington Irving Junior High. He shook his head a couple of times before he began. I'm not lying. This brown pelican, he was beautiful. He could have been as funny looking as the large-billed puffins because he was mostly bill. But put him next to the Arctic tern and you could hardly imagine him flying. The feet, the curve of the neck, the colors, he could have been a hoot, but he wasn't. When you looked at him, it didn't matter how he was put together. He was noble. If you were a bird, you could imagine bowing down to him. Principal Petey has been speaking with Coach Reed, Principal Petey said. You had to wonder what the brown pelican's voice would be like if he could speak. Something deep, but still able to laugh. Warm, easy. Coach Reed says, Douglas, would you mind terribly giving Principal Petey your full attention? You can imagine the brown pelican standing over the black-backed gull at the moment when the gull most needed him and saying that maybe the sky wouldn't be lost after all. Listen, kiddo, you look Principal Petey in the eye. I did. It wasn't easy. I said Principal Petey has been speaking with Coach Reed. You remember that feeling of cold, freezing rain down your back I was telling you about? Principal Petey held up a piece of paper. Coach Reed has had the secretary type up this report for your permanent school record. Just so you know, I should tell you this. I did not say I didn't know the so-called gym teacher could write a report. I did not say that, even though I was tempted. Sometimes I really do get it. He tells Principal Petey that you have been cutting his class for weeks. I've been running, I said. He sees me go out every day at the beginning of the period. Has your class been doing a running unit? I have. The rest of your class hasn't, and guess what? You're not the teacher. He looked down at the piece of paper. It was a blue piece of paper, which I guess made it all fired important. It says here that you've missed the entire wrestling unit. I didn't say anything. How are you going to make that up? I still didn't say anything. I figured that keeping my mouth shut was the best option. I got it. Principal Petey will tell you how you're going to make that up. Coach Reed staggers his unit, so he's starting another one on wrestling for his 5th period class. You be there for that one, and don't even think of missing a day. 5th period is my lunch period, I said. 5th period was your lunch period, he said. Do I still have to do his? Yes, you still have your other period with him too. Principal Petey looked at the blue piece of paper. Volleyball. He must really love me to want to see me twice a day, I said. He doesn't, said Principal Petey, and then he said something that I don't think I want to tell you. It only gets me closer to the dark woods. Saturday deliveries in November are, of course, cold and gray and wet. The sky is as dark and lousy as it is in the background for the snowy heron, which is the Audubon picture that Mr. Powell had turned to because he wanted me to think about composition on several planes at once. But things weren't like they had been in October. On Saturdays now, Mrs. Mason was taking out a couple of donuts again from the 2 dozen I was bringing, and she was putting them on a white plate and setting that beside a mug of hot chocolate that was waiting for me. And Mr. Loeffler, who was reading Jane Eyre because he said I inspired him, liked to tell me that I should see the movie with Orson Welles sometime. And then he'd act out a scene or two and we'd start to laugh because Mr. Loeffler is no actor. And I'm not lying. Afterward, we changed whatever light bulbs needed changing. Then, when I got to the Daughtery's house, Phronsie and Davy and Joel and Polly and Ben would all be waiting to tackle me, and I let them. I never came away from them without 2 or 3 new bruises somewhere. It was great. And Mrs. Windermere, you know how cold it gets when you're walking out to Mrs. Windermere's and Mrs. Mason's hot chocolate is a long time ago and it's misting and freezing and Joe Pepitone's jacket isn't as warm as it could be and you have to walk fast so that you don't start to shiver, but you can't walk too fast because you don't want to tip the stupid wagon over? It's that cold. So when you walk into Mrs. Windermere's kitchen, and it's all warm and cozy like my mother would keep it if this were her kitchen, and you hear Mrs. Windermere typing in the distance, with a god probably sitting beside her with his wings folded, you take your time because you don't want to go out into the cold again. And besides, there's the red-throated divers to look at, and wonder what spectacular thing the mother diver is thinking about, showing her kid next. And then Mrs. Windermere comes in and says, "Skinny delivery boy, do you want a cup of coffee?" I'm not lying. Coffee. And I say, sure. And she says, how do you take it? And I say, black. And she says, fine. And I'm warm all the way back home. And then, on November, Saturday nights, I'd be over to the Daughteries who had decided to give me a chance after all. Maybe they were desperate. Mrs. Daughtery wasn't kidding. 5 kids and every single one of them needed needed to get read to before going to sleep, and it wasn't like you could read to all of them at once or even 3 of them or 2. It was 5 kids, 5 books. This takes a long time. I'm not lying. But I didn't care because I figured it all out, thanks to Miss Cowper's County Literacy Unit. I figured out Sam I Am for Phronsie. I figured out Circus McGurks for Davy. I figured out Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Quack, Pack, and Quack for Joel. I figured out Andy and the thorn in the lion's paws for Polly, and I even figured out why Wilbur is one terrific pig for Ben. You know what this feels like to figure all this out? Do you really know what it feels like? And after the Daughertys came in at night, Mr. Daugherty would drive me back to the dump in his police car. So you might think that things were going pretty well, and I guess they were, but even while eating cinnamon donuts and changing light bulbs and walking back from Mrs. Windermere's and driving to the dump in a police car and working on the Snowy Heron, I'd be thinking about what Principal Petey told me, and you really don't care about composition on several planes at once when you're thinking about what he told me. Look at the diagonals that Audubon sets up first, Mr. Powell said. Go from the tip of the heron's feet to the tip of his beak, and you have the first diagonal. But look at that second diagonal. It's a lot subtler. He starts at the end of this broadleaf in the upper left, right here, and then brings it down across the top edge of this broadleaf, and the bottom edge of this rise in the shore, and the 2 diagonals form, he waited, an X, I said, exactly right, and the center of that X is the lake, which is drawn linearly, long and narrow. Do you see? I got it. So, Mr. Powell said, you have one plane of action in the forefront marked by the diagonals in that one. The heron is stepping out from the higher bush and is trampling this plant. In the other plane, the one on the horizontal, the hunter is in the background, holding his gun and advancing. I nodded. Principal Petey is a jerk. What's interesting is that the 2 planes are going to come together sometime soon after the moment we are seeing, because both the bird and the hunter are approaching the center of the diagonals, which is a composition such as this always intersects at the middle of the page, just like the action will intersect at the middle of the page. It doesn't look like the heron is going to come off too well, I said. Mr. Powell looked at the approaching hunter. Probably not. So this is one dead heron we're looking at. Lo got up from her table where she was doing our English class exercise that was supposed to show us more wonders of the adverb. She looked at the snowy heron. He doesn't look dead to me, she said. Shows how much you know, I said. Okay, that was sounding like Lucas. And dumb. I know, but nobody else in the room had Principal Petey tell him that nobody else in the room knew what it was like to have someone blast away at him, like this heron was going to find out. Lil went back to the adverbs. Mr. Powell was quiet. Then he got out a sheet of paper. Try drawing the contour of the heron without a line. Suggest the feathers, he said, at least until you get the base of the neck. I tried, but I couldn't get it. After Lil closed her book and got up and left without saying a thing, I didn't even want to try to get it. Mr. Sweattick, said Mr. Powell, take the paper home and try it. I shook my head. I left the pencils and the paper there, and I left the snowy heron too, forever in the moment before he was going to be blasted, which he had no idea was coming. He didn't know how lucky he was. One day before Thanksgiving, we got a postcard from Lucas, still not in his handwriting, that said he was coming home finally. He'd be back in the middle of December. Remember, I don't look exactly the same, someone wrote for him. My mother cried and she said that we had a lot to be thankful for this Thanksgiving, and I guess that was true, especially since Mr. Ballard sent home a 22-pound turkey, which I'm not lying, is a big turkey, for every one of his employees. On Thanksgiving Day, my mother put it into the oven right after she got up, and it cooked all morning and half the afternoon so that the whole house was filled with the scent of it. My mother went around smiling until Ernie Echo came. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, I went to 5th period PE class instead of lunch. I sat down at the end of one of the squad lines. The so-called gym teacher made us count off by 2s. No, I didn't say anything about how this was probably as high as he could count, and then he divided us into 2 platoons and told each platoon to line up by height, which took a lot longer than you might think. And then he told us to sit on opposite sides of the mat, spread across the floor, and see who our opponent would be. It was supposed to generate aggression, he said. Terrific. And you know, you have to wonder if the world is fair when It was one of those late fall days in stupid Marysville when a tropical front or something had come up from who knows where, South America, and everything was warm and the yellow sun was shining, and what a sweet day it would be to run or to eat lunch outside. Instead, I was messing around on a gray mat that smelled of the sweat of 1,000 wrestling matches. It was, I had to admit, hard to give the wrestling unit my full attention. Here are the stats from my first match of the period. 1 takedown of me, 1 pin of me, 1 loss for me, match time 8 seconds. I guess you can tell I wasn't paying much attention. The so-called gym teacher came up behind me before my second match when my opponent was staring at me across the mat, generating aggression. "I'm not going to pass you for the unit if you don't try," he said. Here are the stats for the second match of the period. 1 takedown of me, 1 pin of me, a second loss from me. Match time, 36 seconds, which is 4.5 times longer than the first match. The so-called gym teacher eyed me from the other side of the mat. I eyed him back. Then he leaned down and said something to my next opponent, who turned to look at me. The so-called gym teacher said something to him again, and then he walked away. It was sort of creepy, like you were the snowy heron, and you could feel that something was wrong, but you weren't sure, because you hadn't seen the hunter with the gun coming across the horizon yet. But I'm not lying, the stats for the third match were different. When the so-called gym teacher blew his stupid whistle, the other guy and I got into the circle, and I crouched down as if I cared at all, and as we started to circle each other, he said, "Reed wants me to call you a mama's baby." I almost lunged at his throat. "But I'm not," he said quite quickly. "I'm not." We circled some more. "He's a jerk," the guy said. "Let's get something going," hollered the so-called gym teacher. We circled some more. And when my back was to the so-called gym teacher, I said, "Keep circling." So we did. And someone on the edge of the mat started to laugh, and then someone else, and then we started to circle faster, and pretty soon the whole place was laughing except for the so-called gym teacher. And this kid and I were laughing so hard we could hardly keep circling, but we kept going until we were dizzy, and finally the so-called gym teacher hollered at us to sit down, and we did, except we both kept swaying. We were so dizzy. The so-called gym teacher was about as angry as you can see a teacher get. And when he called the next 2 guys up for their match, he could hardly keep the roar out of his sergeant voice. But you know what the 2 guys did? That's right. They circled and circled and circled. I think you can imagine what the so-called gym teacher did. If it had been legal, I think he would have called in firing squads. But since it wasn't legal, he told us that he was going to give every boy in class a big fat 0 for the day, and we could see how we all liked that. Yes, sirree, Buster. We all went in to get changed. We were still laughing. No one in the locker room looked when I took my shirt off. Maybe the snowy heron is going to come off pretty badly when the planes come together. Maybe, but he's still proud and beautiful. His head is high, and he's got this sharp beak that's facing out to the world. He's okay for now. On the first Saturday of December, the month that Lucas was coming home, I waited for Lil outside the library after the deliveries. It was cold, and I'm not lying. The sky was iron, and Mrs. Windermere's coffee had worn off way before I got back into town, even before I passed the open meadow. A few snowflakes blew past in a hurry, which is how most people went by too, all huddled together and their heads down and their arms close in. So you can see it was kind of noble for me to wait outside for her. But I hadn't really talked to her since Thanksgiving, and I guess I wanted to make sure that she wasn't still thinking of my stupid "shows how much you know," like I was still thinking of Principal Petey's stupid "what he said." She came up the street with a load of books and stomped up the 6 steps to where I was waiting, and I said hey, and she said hey, but she said it in a way that meant she wasn't really saying hey. She was really saying, "You are such a jerk, and I wish you would drop into some crack." So I knew she hadn't forgotten. "Are you coming into the library?" I said, and she looked at me like she was generating aggression, and she said, "Not now." "I wish you would," I said. "It's not much fun just drawing with Mr. Powell." "Oh," she said, "I didn't realize. Well, I don't know very much about it, do I?" "If we stop at your dad's deli, we could get 2 Cokes," I said. "Do you have any money?" She said, "No." "Then what you're really saying is if we stopped in my dad's deli, I could get you a Coke, right?" I shrugged and smiled. Lil Spicer shook her head and she laughed, and I'm not lying, she smiled too. "You know," she said, "you should smile more often." She handed me her books and took my arm. "Let's go," she said. That afternoon, after our Cokes, I drew that snowy heron like I was John James Audubon himself. Except my heron, he was striding out into the world like that hunter would never, never come. Finally, in the middle of December, we drove down to New York City in my father's new pickup, my father, my mother, and me. We left my brother home, first because we wouldn't have room for him in the pickup once Lucas got there, and second because my father wanted him to move the furniture around in our bedroom upstairs so that we could fit another bed in. This wasn't going to be easy, which my brother had pointed out and which my father had answered with, you know. I sat between them. My father was glaring at the cars on the expressway as if he were daring them to even try dinging up his new pickup. I wasn't sure why he was so all-fired worried about it. It was already pretty dinged up. You don't get a whole lot for $100 down payment, I guess. But whenever someone closed in on him, he rolled his window down and let them know, even though they had their windows rolled up because it was about 0 degrees outside. Of course, when my father opened his window, it made it about 0 degrees inside too, and it didn't get warm again because the heater didn't work in his new pickup. I guess he forgot when he bought it that we weren't living in, say, Miami. My mother was wearing her best blue coat. She looked out the window too most of the time. It was like she was trying to peer across the miles right into the city to find Lucas. Every time a bus passed us, she looked into all the windows. Who knew he might be there? Me, I was watching for Joe Pepitone whenever a Ford Mustang drove by, because Joe Pepitone is the kind of guy who would drive a Ford Mustang. We got lost 3 times in New York City because my father said no one knew what they were doing when they laid out all the streets. Nothing made sense. And if you were there, you wouldn't either have pointed out that it made perfect sense since the whole city is on a grid. You know you wouldn't. When we finally found the Port Authority bus station, we drove around it 8 times because he wasn't going to park in one of those garages where they take your money and then go joyriding in your truck. Not him. He was going to find a spot on the street, which we finally did about half a mile away, which took a whole lot longer to drive than you might think because we had to creep through the Stop the War protest that was spilling into all the side streets. By the time my father edged the pickup into a spot, my mother was near frantic. When he finally switched off the ignition, she got out and I got out, and my mother started to walk toward the Port Authority. "Just hold on," my father called. "If we don't hurry," she said, "we won't be there when his bus pulls in." "So what?" he said. "He's been gone My mother didn't wait for him to finish. She turned away and began walking. I could have cheered. We were there on the bottom level of the Port Authority when Lucas's bus pulled in. My father, a couple of minutes after. I wish I could tell you what it was like watching my mother smile while the bus parked. I wish I could tell you. But maybe you know, and I don't have to. There was a smell of diesel and the screech of air brakes and the big engine of the bus echoing off the cement walls and ceiling. There was a crowd of people all looking for someone they cared about, who was on the bus and coming home for Christmas. There was a driver switching off the engine, taking off his hat and stretching, pushing back his hair. He reached forward and pulled a lever, and the doors opened, and he got out and stretched again, then walked over to the luggage bins and bent to open them. And there were the passengers starting to get out, and they weren't Lucas. And they walked slow and unsteady like they'd been crinkled up for a while in a seat too small, and one by one they turned to the crowd and waved at someone, and that someone would run up, and they'd hug and kiss, and then go find their luggage. That's how it was, one by one, everyone coming off the bus, holding the rail as they stepped out, until everyone was off the bus and the bus driver was standing by the empty luggage bins and closing them up, and then he looked over at us. "You folks waiting for a kid in a wheelchair?" he said. "No," said my father. But my mother gasped, and then she was running. She flew past the bus driver and up the stairs of the bus. We could hear her steps as she ran to the back. I came up behind her, and this is what I saw. My mother was kneeling down in front of my brother Lucas. One of the overhead lights was shining brightly on her hair, turning it all gold. She held Lucas's face in both her hands. Her blue coat was spread out, and it covered them both like wide wings, covered even the chair my brother was sitting in. She was kissing him, but I couldn't see his face until she reached to hold him close to her, and she put her head beside his. Then I could see him. I could see the wide gauze bandage across his eyes. And, oh goodness, it wasn't until she stood and turned to me that I could see why Lucas was in the chair. Both his legs were missing, above the knees. My mother looked at me. That smile. Next to them stood a smart soldier, his uniform perfect, his hat off and under his arm, looking away like he wasn't supposed to be seeing this. I walked down the aisle, touching each of the seats as I passed them. My mother watched each step I took. When I was in front of the wheelchair, she put her hand on the back of my brother's head, and he leaned into her. "Lucas," I said. He tilted his face up to me. "Hi, Duggo," he said. He reached out and I took his hand. It was trembling a little. "I got dinged up," he said. "A little bit," I said. He smiled. I never saw it before, but he smiles like my mother. The soldier and I got Lucas down from the bus. It wasn't easy, and I think we hurt Lucas twice trying to get him down the bus steps, and again when we crowded him into the elevator, and again when we crowded him out of the elevator. But he never said a thing, and when we finally got him on the ground floor, he reached out, and the soldier shook his hand, and Lucas said, "Thank you, sir," and the soldier said it was an honor, and he saluted Lucas, who couldn't see him, but Lucas saluted back as if he somehow knew. Then my mother took his hand, and I got behind the chair and pushed him through the Port Authority and out onto the street. "Where are we?" he said. "New York City," I said. He lifted his face up to the air. The bright, cold sunshine shone down on him, but he couldn't see it. He was smelling instead. And then he turned his head because he was hearing what suddenly we were all hearing. The Stop the War protest was marching toward us. People holding up signs with letters that dripped like blood, screaming into bullhorns, chanting and sort of looking like the hunter, coming across the horizontal to the meeting of the diagonals, which is where we were standing. When the marchers in front saw us, they tried to hold back, but the power of the marchers behind heaved them forward, and so instead they turned sideways and skirted around us until we were in a pocket, with the crowd touching us everywhere. And you know what they said when they saw my brother in his uniform sitting in a wheelchair with bandages around his eyes, his legs gone? You know what they said? They said he got what he deserved. They said they were glad his eyes were gone. They said they were glad his legs were gone. They said he got done to him what he did to Vietnamese babies, and how did he like it? They said that's what happens when you let yourself get used by fascist pigs. My mother tried to get in front of Lucas, but the crowd was so thick and so close that she couldn't work herself around the wheelchair. She looked back at my father, and he pushed himself past her and stood in front of Lucas, who sat there the whole time, facing straight out, even when someone spit on him. He didn't say anything. He just took it like there was nothing else he could do. You know what that feels like? It feels like having Principal Petey tell you that not a single teacher in the whole school gives a rip about you. Not a rip. Because they all gave up on you a long time ago, like on the day you started. That's what it feels like. It probably went on like that for only a few minutes, but it felt a lot longer. And when the crowd finally thinned out and the last protester had hated him, we got back to the pickup and my father started it up while my mother and I helped Lucas out of the wheelchair and into the cab, and my father swore when he had to get out after my mother came around the front to get in through the driver's side. I got in the back and pulled the wheelchair into the pickup. It was heavier than I thought it would be, and I had to be careful because my father sure hoped I wasn't digging up his pickup while I was getting that thing in. I put the wheelchair down on the side and leaned against it so it wouldn't roll around as we headed out of Manhattan and back up toward Marysville to a house my brother had never seen and maybe wouldn't see now. Not that he was missing much. It was a long drive, and I think you can imagine how cold it was for one of us especially, but I kept wondering every time we hit a bump and the stupid shocks on the pickup didn't do a thing, how much it was hurting Lucas. Probably a lot. When we pulled into the driveway, my father got out and went into the dump. I lowered the wheelchair over the side and jumped out and opened the door. Lucas's face was pretty grim. I'm not lying. My mother had been crying, so her face was pretty grim too. I wasn't sure how we were going to get Lucas out of the pickup, especially without hurting him more. I guess he wondered about that too, because he said, "Doug, if you will the thing below me, maybe I could sort of fall into it." It took me a couple of seconds to see that he was kidding, even though there's nothing funny about missing your legs, you know. Then the front door of the dump opened, and I thought it was probably my father coming back to help out. It wasn't. It was my brother. He looked at me, then he looked inside the truck at my mother and Lucas. "Lucas," he said. "Hey," said Lucas. My brother looked at me again, and then he reached into the pickup. "Tell me if this hurts," he said, and he reached around Lucas, and Lucas reached an arm around my brother's neck, and he lifted him out, just like that, and set him down in the wheelchair. "Thanks, little brother," said Lucas. And my brother Christopher, he said, "Any time, Lucas, whenever you want." So we wheeled Lucas into the dump, and my father said, "How did we think we were going to get him up to our room in a wheelchair?" And Christopher said, "We got it figured out." And Lucas gave that smile. I really did try to care during the volleyball unit in PE that week, but you have to admit volleyball is not that great a sport. You don't hear Jim McKay announcing the thrill of victory that comes from winning a volleyball game. I mean, slapping a ball around and getting it over a net, what's the point to that? There's a reason that no one carries stats about volleyball around in his head, but I really did try to care. And I even tried to care about the wrestling unit, not enough to try to win, but enough to keep things going for a minute or two without a whole lot of circling, which the so-called gym teacher announced would get the 2 circlers 2 more big fat zeros. And no, I didn't say a thing about my surprise at him being able to understand the mathematical concept of 0. Remember, I got it. And I didn't even complain about having to be in the wrestling unit at all, which I had reason to, since you may have noticed that James Russell and Otis Bottom weren't there with me, even though they had missed most of the wrestling unit too. But so what? So what? If the so-called gym teacher wants to be the jerk of the world, so what? If he wants to boom around in his sergeant voice, so what? But maybe you can understand a little when I tell you that when the so-called gym teacher hollered at me during volleyball that I should go after those balls and not act like a mama's baby, you can understand why I got the volleyball and was about to throw it as hard as I could into his sneering face, but I held back. And I'm not lying, it wasn't easy. And I told him to shut up, just shut up, and he sneered some more and said I would never throw the volleyball because I knew what would happen to me. My mother would be all upset, wouldn't she? I almost threw it. I almost did. But I didn't. I smiled, the way Lil Spicer likes. Then I took off my shirt and threw it into the bleachers. I went back and served the stupid ball over the stupid net. Overhand. Stats for the game. I don't remember. My platoon lost. It's volleyball. Who cares? It wasn't exactly the agony of defeat. It was something a whole lot better. But I'm not lying. All that week, the so-called gym teacher did not let up. On Tuesday, he made 3 guys in the wrestling unit run the bleachers all period because they weren't trying hard enough. Guess who was one of the 3 guys? Then later, during volleyball, he made 2 guys clean off the scuff marks in the gym floors with old tennis balls. Guess who was one of the 2 guys? On Wednesday, during the wrestling unit, he made 2 guys run the bleachers all period because they weren't trying hard enough. Guess who was one of the 2? And in volleyball, I had to finish all the scuff marks I'd missed on my side of the floor. On Thursday, he had 4 guys finally wash the sweaty wrestling mats down. Guess who was one of the 4? In volleyball, he told 4 guys that they were going to stand in the middle of the court and try to retrieve balls that were spiked down to them. We were supposed to dive. You know what that feels like, diving onto a gym floor for 43 minutes? Then he told us that the next day would be the stunning climax of the wrestling and volleyball units. Terrific. So on Friday, the last day before Christmas vacation, the so-called gym teacher said he had picked random wrestling partners by choosing our names from slips of paper he'd cut up and put into a hat. He held up his clipboard. He said he'd call out the names 2 by 2, starting with the first pair to wrestle. Guess who was in the first pair? My partner turned out to be Alfred Harnett. I'll let you guess again. Do you think Alfred Harnett weighed about the same as me or about 16 times more? The so-called gym teacher smiled, and when he called my name and then Alfred Harnett's, he put the clipboard down on the bleachers and leaned back. Let's get it going, he said. I'm not lying. Even if I had been trying, it wouldn't have made any difference. Alfred Harnett laid an arm across me, and I went down. It was, for the record, his left arm, not his strong side. He was a good guy. So, the so-called gym teacher thought it was hilarious. After the period, he went back to his office and left 2 guys, me and Alfred Harnett, hilarious, to roll up the mats for Christmas vacation. They weren't so bad because, as you might remember, they had gotten cleaned off earlier that week. When we finished, we walked back toward the locker room, and I saw that the so-called gym teacher had left his clipboard and the slips of paper on the bleacher. I looked at the clipboard. Wouldn't you have wanted to know? Not a single name on it. The so-called gym teacher had set it all up. There wasn't anything random at all. The jerk. I flipped over the page. Blank. Hey, Alfred, I said. I flipped over another page. It wasn't blank. It was a drawing of James Russell going for a layup. Behind him you can make out every kid in our platoon. I'm not lying. The so-called gym teacher knew something about composition on several planes at once. I flipped over another page. Otis Bottom hanging about halfway up the climbing rope, looking like there was no way in creation he was going to get up any higher. Another page, me, running. Another page, our whole platoon smacking volleyballs around. Another page, our whole platoon really playing volleyball this time. Me serving, no shirt, and no tattoo. I looked at that a while. Then I skipped some pages and turned to the back of the pad and stopped. A drawing of a low road between high grasses. Bodies, lots of bodies, all jumbled and thrown on top of one another. Another page. A Vietnamese man, old and worn, dead, his eyes open, and his body lying crooked on the ground. Behind him a young girl, naked, reaching for his hand, but she had never made it. Another page. A boy, younger than me, a straw hat broken underneath him, his face, what was left of it, with a terrified eye. Burning huts behind him, bodies all along the road to the huts, the words, "My lie," at the bottom, and I was there. "Sweatik, what do you think you're doing?" It was a so-called gym teacher. He came across the gym like a thunderhead bearing down across the valley and grabbed the clipboard out of my hands. "What are you doing? Looking at my personal things?" "Coach," I said. "You get out of here," screaming, shrieking sergeant voice. "You get out of here. Never touch my things again. Did you hear me? You get out." I went into the locker room to change. Later that day, Miss Cowper and I didn't ask for this. It just seemed to happen. Miss Cowper wrote me an excuse from PE so that I could help her refresh her county literacy unit. I never did find out what the stunning climax of the volleyball unit was. Lucas didn't talk much, and when he did talk, it was never around my father. He was mostly around my mother. You could hear him late at night when everything was quiet and dark. There would be these low voices, then quiet, then the low voices again, sometimes crying. Every night when they were alone, my mother would change the gauze bandage around Lucas's eyes. Then her voice would call quietly up the stairs, and Christopher would go down to bring Lucas up to our bedroom. He wouldn't talk about what happened, how he lost his legs and maybe his eyes. Sometimes you'd come into the kitchen, and he would be sitting by the kitchen table where the sunlight was coming in, and he'd have his face raised to it like he could see its warmth. Sometimes you saw him try to lift his body up and down in the chair like he was lifting a weight, which he pretty much was. Sometimes he would get letters from people in his unit, or from the doctors and nurses who had worked on him after he was wounded. I told him I would read them for him. He never wanted me to. He told me to throw them all away, which I didn't. His stumps hurt him, and sometimes he would reach down to where his legs used to be. He wanted to scratch them, but there was no place to scratch. He'd still try, and then he'd give up and put his hands over his face, and you could tell he was doing everything he could to not let himself think that everything was ruined forever. We were supposed to go down with Lucas to a doctor in New York City every 2 weeks for who knows how long, but when my father said he could be trapezing all over the state every 2 weeks, we found a doctor in Kingston who would see him, and when my father put up an all-fired fuss at the first visit about how much it cost, the doctor said he had a son in Vietnam too, right now, a medic, so he'd take Lucas on for as long as his son was over there, and my father said he wasn't asking for any freaking charity, and the doctor stopped talking to him and told Lucas he'd see him in 2 weeks, and he'd give him some exercises to work on. Lucas didn't do them. 2 weeks later, just before school was about to start after Christmas vacation, we went up to Kingston again, and the doctor had an eye doctor waiting too. My father said he wasn't going to get gypped, and he hadn't brought any money, so if he thought that, the eye doctor turned his back on him and unwrapped the gauze from Lucas's face. Then he turned to my father. "Anything else?" he said. It was the first time my father had seen Lucas without the bandage. It was the first time I had too. Burns all across his face. Whatever skin was left was shiny and stretched. His eyebrows and eyelashes were gone. It looked like for good. And everything was seeping. Everything looked wet and raw. He'd lost the sky. Christmas, as you can guess, wasn't exactly ho-ho-ho around our house. On Christmas Eve, my father went out somewhere with Ernie Echo, and Lucas didn't want to go to midnight mass, and so Christopher stayed with him, and my mother and I went. We didn't have a tree, and if it hadn't been for the ham that Mr. Ballard sent home to all his employees, I think we would have been celebrating with thawed hamburgers. Presents? Forget it. So I went to St. Ignatius, and it was cold and damp like it usually was, outside and inside, except inside there were more candles lit than you'd think could fit inside a single church. Up front, there were 2 balsam trees, and their scent mixed with the waxy smell of the candles, and there was a cradle beside the altar, a blue cloth draped over it, and there was a choir of perfect boys in perfect white robes with perfect combed hair, singing their perfect notes like everything was perfect, and I thought of Lucas back home in his wheelchair, and so I couldn't understand it when my mother turned to me during Hark the Herald Angels Sing and said loud enough to hear over the organ and the perfect choir, "What a wonderful Christmas this is." I shivered. Even with all those candles, it was still cold. That wasn't the only time I shivered. I shivered late at night after Christopher carried Lucas up to bed and we had gotten him in and covered. Then we would lie awake and listen to his dreams, and I would see the young boy with the broken straw hat, the burning huts, the girl's hand. My lie, I was there. Then Lucas would try to turn over, and there would be a low moan, and Christopher would get up, and I knew that Lucas was awake in the dark, and he carried around with him all the time. "What can I do?" Christopher would say. "You weren't there. You can't do anything." None of us knew how to make it light. At the beginning of the first physical science class of the new year, Mr. Ferris sent Clarence on the front lab table and started him rocking. "Do you know, Otis Bottom," he asked, "what historic event in the sciences will occur during this new year of 1969? Otis Bottom looked like he didn't really want to be back from Christmas break yet. He could have guessed all day and not gotten close. "Doug Sweattick?" Mr. Ferris asked. "The moonshot," whispered Lil. "The moonshot," I said. "Thank you, Lil Spicer. Yes, the moonshot. Apollo 8 has circumnavigated the moon and descended to 69.8 miles over the lunar surface. Think of that. From the very beginning of human consciousness, we have looked at the moon and wondered what it would be like to walk on it. In 1969, what man has wondered about for thousands and thousands of years, you may be able to see on your television screens. It is our first step into the solar system. It is our first step into the galaxy." Clarence was really rocking. I'm not lying. "So what are they going to find there?" Otis Bottom was trying to recover. "Ah, Otis Bottom, that is the question. What are they going to find there? Who knows? Maybe everything will be exactly as they expect. Maybe everything will be a surprise. But one day soon, man will walk across the soil of the lunar landscape, and that will be a sign of our progress. In a time when it doesn't seem as if we're making much progress anywhere else, this, ladies and gentlemen, is a sign of tremendous possibility. And that, Otis Bottom, is perhaps the best answer to your question. They will find possibility there." I thought of Lucas and his darkness. Wouldn't he like to see it? I went through the rest of the day in a kind of daze. I mean, the moon. Possibility. Geez, the moon. In January, all of Coach Reed's classes were starting a new unit in PE, physical fitness and endurance. We were going to have a whole lot of tests to see how many sit-ups we could do in 4 minutes, and how many push-ups and squat thrusts and leg lifts and chin-ups, along with timed 100-yard dashes and mile runs. We were supposed to compare ourselves to the President's Council on Physical Fitness goals that all American boys should be trying to reach so we wouldn't die of heart attacks someday. So that period we spent practicing the correct way to do push-ups and sit-ups, and after that we took turns holding each other's ankles and counting sit-ups, or holding fists beneath each other so that you could tell how far down your chest had to go for a good push-up. And we got timed for a trial run. It was about as exciting as it sounds. You know how the snowy heron has its beak pointed out to the world? How it doesn't care that the hunter is coming up the path? How he looks at the hunter and says, "So what?" How he sees possibility. After class, when everyone was headed into the locker room, I stopped at Coach Reed's office. He was sitting behind his desk, which was covered with presidential fitness charts, with lots of little spaces that needed filling in. "Hello," I said. He looked up from his clipboard, then turned it over. "What do you want?" he said. "I saw some of your drawings. You're good," I said. He looked at the face-down clipboard. Then he looked at me with suspicious eyes. "So? You drew the war," I said. Coach Reed not saying anything, his hand pressing down on the clipboard, pressing it into the desk. "My brother was there too," I said. "He's back." A long minute passing. "No, he's not," said Coach Reed finally, not his sergeant voice. "No one ever comes back from Vietnam. Not really." He picked up the clipboard and held it against his chest. "He's not reading the letters he gets." Coach Reed nodded. "He needs someone who knows what it was like." Coach Reed looked at me. I looked at the clipboard. "Maybe you do too," I said. "Get out, Sweattick," he said. "I'm busy." Sergeant voice back. "I could help," I said. He laughed, not a happy laugh. "Help," he said. "I could take care of those charts. I could write down everyone's names and keep track of where they start, what kind of progress they make, where they finish, stats like that." Coach Reed got up and sat on the edge of his desk. "Why so helpful?" he said. "Do you want me to do it or not?" "Not," he said. I shrugged. "Okay." I turned to go. Wait a minute, he said. He fingered the clipboard. I'll think about it. Go get changed. I'll let you know when you come back. I nodded. Okay. When I came back, his office door was closed, but on the door there was a note. Sweatic, it said, start with the second period stats. I stayed after school to start. You know, Mr. Powell, I said the next Saturday, I don't think Audubon had this right. I mean, about the hunter. Do you think he's in the wrong place in the picture? No, he shouldn't be in the picture at all. What would you have me put there instead? Another heron. He's just seen her, and he's going to fly over to say hi. It would be a different story, said Mr. Powell. What do you think, Lil? She came over and looked at the picture. Then she took my hand. You know what that feels like? Like what the astronauts will feel when they step onto the moon for the very first time. Like what might happen if Coach Reed rang the doorbell at the dump some afternoon and sat down next to Lucas. Like knowing that Principal Petey is wrong about what he said. Like laying a missing bird picture back where it's supposed to be. Like someone seeing what a chump you are and getting you a cold Coke anyway. Like possibility.